This is your final lecture for Philosophy 220, a study of ethics, and in this final lecture we'll be looking at moral theory as it pertains to politics, most especially global politics.
Okay, justice is a key concept in all of moral theory and in any ethical decision that we make. It is unequivocally the goal of any ethical decision. What I mean by unequivocally is there's no question about this, there's no debate about this, that justice is the goal of an ethical decision. The debate enters in classes such as ours over what is justice and how are we going to define justice and what outcome would include the greatest amount of justice. Now, you may not have given much thought to this, but justice is sort of an ethereal term. I mean, what do we mean when we say justice? When I say justice, does that mean the same thing of what you think of as justice? And what we don't really give thought to sometimes is the fact that we do oftentimes take for granted that what I think of as justice, I'm taking for granted that's what you think justice is. Same thing with other virtue words like love or mercy or kindness. We have this sort of blindness or tunnel vision of being locked in thinking, okay, the way that I view what that means is what everybody thinks. And that's certainly not the case, and something that we really have to hammer out in an ethics class, anything dealing with moral theory. What exactly do we mean by justice, and make sure that we understand what other people mean by justice. Okay, so a working definition for this issue of global economic justice, and of course the wider umbrella of politics that I'm going to place that in. Here's our working definition. Justice occurs when individuals and communities receive fair treatment and the resources that are due them. Okay, now certainly there can be a debate within that on what is fair treatment and what resources are due to individuals, but that is a fair, broad definition for what justice means. When justice exists, persons have their personal rights recognized. And if you've already done your reading from the chapter, we know that there are two basic viewpoints on what a person's personal rights are. Negative rights, and negative rights means that a person is left in a place of freedom and liberty, that another person is not imposing harm on that individual. So in other words, there's no interference. You are allowed to live your life with liberty and freedom. Almost everyone holds to the concept of negative rights. So more of the debate comes in when we move to positive rights. And some people will argue that there should not be the recognition of positive rights, while others say that we must have positive rights. And when we say positive rights, this means that individuals who are living a life of lacking, not having the resources available to them that are available to other people, that there is a positive right that they have to receive that from the other person. Okay, so a positive right means that there is a lack. Okay, something is missing, and for justice to be present, that person needs that resource, and so therefore the positive right will impose itself on someone else's life so that the person who is lacking can have what he or she needs. So again, pretty much across the board, negative rights are accepted by moral theorists as existing, and the debate comes in on positive rights. Okay, here's where I want to begin taking things in a little bit of a different direction than your author did. Let's begin with the Greek term polis. It's the Greek term for city, but it becomes the primary word that we use, the primary concept behind what we call politics. And when we come to politics, we are deciding what laws, ethics, morality, what we're going to hold most important within our community. But the polis, the city in politics, is the community. How do you define your community when it comes to your polis, in which you're going to have these laws, or you're going to have this moral code, these moral obligations? In what community do you impose that? Into what community do you bring that? And you can see some different policies pictured here. The top left, of course, is a family, and that is one particular very small community. And there are certain expectations and obligations that you have within that polis, within the community of the family. And you can zoom out a little bit from that polis, and you see another polis. Here is a picture of some distance away of a neighborhood, and the understanding of you may have certain obligations or expectations from a neighbor, and you may have a certain closeness because of the physical proximity you have to one another. Then we go back a little bit more and you see a map of the United States here. We sometimes get into issues of patriotism here, of understanding that this is my community, this is my nation, this is my people. And certainly we have particular laws that are recognized on a national level, a federal level, that describe the obligations and expectations that we have to and from one another. And then we now move into the territory that we have with your author this week of looking at the polis as the entire world, the polis as the globe, the entire planet. And so are we a polis? Are we a community as the world? And if so, then there are going to be some moral obligations or expectations that we would need to define. And so when it comes to defining community, understanding community, it's not that we just pick one of these and that's the only one we belong to. We have an understanding that we belong to all four, but our understanding of moral obligation changes going from polis to polis. And so therefore your political convictions will have a great deal to do with how you define your community. And here are some big questions that you would need to ask yourself when coming to the question of global economic justice and understanding of the size of your community. How big is your community? Again, it's going to depend on what the issue is that you're addressing. Who belongs? Who doesn't belong? And of course, does the community size change pertaining to what issue we are discussing? And I certainly think it does. And for this week, we're looking at economy. So we'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. Okay, the primary political ideologies that we look at, and your author did a great job on both of these. The libertarian political ideology places the most emphasis on an individual's rights. So from a libertarian perspective, what is the most important thing that must be sustained, the most important right? And that is your individual rights, your personal liberty. As long as your actions are not causing harm to another person, you should be able to do what you want. There is no recognition within a libertarian political ideology of positive rights. You are not morally obliged to make a sacrifice or to do something for another person who is in need. And in our culture, there is a strong libertarian wing within the Republican Party. Say one more thing here. This is not saying within the political ideology of don't make sacrifices for the sake of others. It's simply saying you're not morally obliged to do that. The libertarian would simultaneously, while holding that conviction, teach the virtue of charity, being a philanthropist. So it's not that you're morally obliged to write out a check that will help feed the hungry, but that you may also have developed the virtue of charity, and that virtue of charity is what compels you to write the check. But again, no moral obligation there. And secondly, the egalitarian political ideology places the most emphasis on equality within the polis, equality within the community, extending, of course, even to a global community. Positive rights are recognized as demanding that wealthier individuals must make morally obligated sacrifice to better the condition of the poor. Within our culture, there is a strong egalitarian wing within the Democratic Party, and in one particular tradition of the egalitarian approach is a political party that many American people when they just hear the word, it makes them cringe a little bit. And you notice on our political landscape, whenever you hear someone say the word socialist, people will tend to react in a very negative way. But socialism really does take some of the egalitarian convictions and tries to put that in a very practical political system. Okay, so let's look at the two major differences that we have pertaining to negative rights and positive rights within that libertarian egalitarian divide. Of course, negative rights only within the libertarian approach, but a strong emphasis placed upon positive rights to go beside negative rights within the egalitarian approach. So, with those living in poverty and those who do not have access to resources that are necessary for a healthy and good and fair and perhaps what we would say just life, since we're talking about justice, what about those people around the world? Are we who are wealthier morally obligated to try to help them and provide for them, or is the help that we might offer simply based upon the virtue of charity and not a moral obligation? Utilitarians and non-consequentialists both make moral arguments in favor of libertarian convictions sometimes, and then others will go in a more egalitarian direction. A utilitarian libertarian, isn't that a mouthful? A utilitarian libertarian may argue that what appears to be distributive justice, let's listen to that phrase, distributive justice, justice that means there must be a redistribution of goods, the concept of sharing the wealth. So a utilitarian libertarian could make the argument that what appears to be distributive justice, a good thing, could actually end up causing greater injustice. A utilitarian egalitarian, taking the other approach, argues that a greater balance of resources in the world will result in the greater overall good for the world. Now listen to that last part, the greater overall good, looking at a consequence, a utilitarian approach. You all should be quite accustomed to hearing that sort of language from utilitarian arguments by now. And then lastly, non-consequentialists or Kantians will make their arguments strictly on the grounds of whether the issue of individual liberty or equality is understood to be of greater importance. And that's pretty easy to understand. A non-consequentialist, again, not looking at the consequences, is simply looking at two different convictions of things that are considered good. Individual liberty on the one hand, or equality within the polis, equality within the community on the other hand. And whichever one of those issues, whichever one of those convictions the non-consequentialist holds to be most important, will determine his or her viewpoint over whether the economic injustice around the world is something we are morally obliged to address, or whether that simply stems from our own philanthropy or charity.